So as I mentioned, well, as I've mentioned a number of different times, I think at this point, the two types of hats that you're wearing when you're creating pictures fall roughly into these categories. Right? You have, oh, nibs breaking, structural decisions that you're making, and those things generally have some sort of emotional consequence, right, or emotional aspect attached to them. Structural stuff is basically referring to things like perspective, things like where you designate a focal area, where directional paths are leading you towards that focal area, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of the reasons why perspective stuff is so important right at the beginning, is that because it's literally, you can think about the structure of a drawing being very similar to, say, the structure of a house or a building. If you want to change the exterior shape to any significant degree of that building, you literally have to change the structure of that building, change the bones of it. So when we choose a particular perspective, for instance, if you decide to change that perspective, right, or that camera angle, say halfway through the drawing, basically everything about the drawing and its details has to change as well. Okay, so this is kind of like a foundational thing that we're building details on top of. Those foundational things have emotional consequences. So you choose a particular structure in order to make a picture feel a particular way. And for our purposes, these structural things are basically divided up into two rough categories. You have pictures that create single focal points, and you have pictures that create multiple focal points. And depending on what it is that you want to do, each is going to be more appropriate than the other, right? And they're all going to have emotional consequences. Now, we've already done a bunch of this stuff here, and all I've got to do is effectively point in between the margins, or make comments in the margins. So how do we know how to create focus so far? Give me all the reasons.
Contrast.
Contrast, great. Okay, so that's one thing.
Breathing space.
Right, breathing space, right? So AKA focal area. Right, and what does that do? Why is breathing space itself doesn't create focus, but what does it do to the focal point that creates focus?
Isolation.
It isolates that object, right, from the rest of the environment. Right, so that's great. Right, what else?
Position.
What's that? Sorry, I missed that.
Like position, or is that the same as breathing space?
No, position is good. What about position? Where inside the frame is the important part?
The center.
The center. Okay, so central positioning. What else?
Uniqueness.
Unique, great. What else? One more.
1 point vanishing point.
1 point vanishing point. Okay, so you have all of these different ways of creating focus, right? And these, right, in some aspects, right, are structural. Where you put that focal point is a structural decision. Right? So where you put that focal area, rather, is a structural decision. If you choose to put that focal area in a central position, that's a structural decision. Where you locate the 1 point vanishing point is a structural decision. Uniqueness, right, and the fact that isolation occurs because of this, right, and contrast, those are more what you might call like decorative decisions, right, or surface decisions. Those are things that accentuate the structure that you've already developed. Okay, so we've already done a bunch of this stuff. This all still plays a part in terms of the gloss that we're going to put on it. Now, so when we refer to, or when we place things in a central position, that's one characteristic of what we would call a symmetrical structure. Now, symmetry has a bunch of different ways that you can talk about it, right? So it's important to clarify what we mean. one way of talking about symmetry is vertical symmetry, where you have, say, a sun setting over top of a perfectly calm body of water, right? And then you get as above, so below, so to speak, a perfect reflection. That's one type of symmetry. You could Dutch that thing and have diagonal symmetry, right? So you get the exact same thing here as you do there, or vice versa. You could have radial symmetry. Radial symmetry kind of being like a peacock's feather or peacock's feathers, right? All radiating from a single point, right? And having the exact same stuff radiating from that single point. These are all valid types of symmetry. The important part, or the important type of symmetry for us, is lateral symmetry. And this has a lot to do with how we, right, read pictures, right, or read the world in general. We tend to read imagery from left to right. Right? And for those of you who are guys are going to get into like some sort of graphic design, right, version, say if you opened up a pamphlet, for example, that's a trifold type of pamphlet, right? This is generally speaking how people read, right, that pamphlet, which would affect how you would lay out things inside of that particular thing. And this doesn't seem to be culturally or sociologically specific, meaning that this doesn't seem to matter in terms of best evidence at this point, to point to where you were born, how you read, top to bottom, left to right, right to left, right, etc. What this seems to do, or what this seems to reflect, is a development in the brain around about age 13 or 14, or 13 to 15, that privileges things out of the left visual, or out of the left visual field over things out of the right visual field, which generally means that we recognize things that come into our left visual field a little bit quicker than we do out of our right visual field, which means that we tend to do this more quickly and more naturally than we do this. So this seems to be the case, right? And seems to be the case, right, for a variety of reasons, mainly because this seems to be what people in general respond to when asked the question, how do you read this picture, right? How do you, right, visually scan this picture? So because of this privileging of a lateral movement, as opposed to, say, a vertical up and down movement, lateral symmetry, right, and the central positioning, right, becomes key. Now, realistically, anywhere along this central vertical axis, if you put this focal area, that breathing space along that central axis, anything that you put inside of that is going to become a focal point, right, because of the central position. Now, if you want something that's even more kind of obvious, you can mix these two, where you put a focal point directly in the middle of your frame, right? This is what you would refer to as, say, perfect symmetry. And the reason that this area here is important, right, is because your brain naturally, as we've kind of mentioned numerous times up until this point, your brain is a pattern-seeking creature. It naturally wants to take any regularly bounded object, like the frame, and do this to it. It wants to divide it in half, vertically, horizontally, diagonally. And what that does is creates a confluence of points towards the center of the frame. This is almost identical to what one-point perspective does. This confluence of points of recessional lines. What this does is create visual tension. And all forms of visual tension, like this, create focus. Now, the difference between the two is that these are invisible lines, so to speak. Your brain is creating, right? As opposed to oftentimes visible lines, right? Objects that are receding towards a point. For all intents and purposes, whether they're visible or invisible, it doesn't make any difference. Your brain recognizes that pattern, and as a result, it privileges the center of the frame as being this special place with respect to an image. And as a result, even if there's nothing there, there's going to be an expectation that something is going to be included in that area. right? So when we obviously set up, say, an empty space in the center of the frame, it increases that expectation, right, for your audience, right, in that it's going to be filled by something. Now, we've already done this, right? This is essentially what the repetition assignment that you guys did, right? That was the whole point of developing that, was to introduce this at an early stage so that we can just put a gloss on it later on. That's only one characteristic of symmetry, though, for our purposes. The other characteristic to accentuate this is we need something called visual balance. Right? Visual balance means that you have, you could call it visual balance or visual weight. Either will do. Think about the frame as basically being a seesaw, teeter-totter, right? Whatever it is that you call these things. If you put a weight on this side, this whole thing is going to tilt down on that side. If you put an equal weight on the other side, that thing levels off, right? So what we want is, not only do we want a focal point in the center of the frame directly over top of that fulcrum, but we want an equal amount of stuff on either side of that frame. Now, in perfect symmetry, that stuff is exactly the same. But you can create symmetry, right, and visual balance by having different stuff on either side, as long as it feels like it has the same visual weight. So things that create visual weight. For instance, if I put a tree here, that tree has a certain size to it. If I put a tree of a smaller size over here, this obviously has less visual weight to it, right, because it's physically taking up less space. However, if I made that tree in really high contrast has a much heavier weight to it than low contrast. So I can balance those things out in that way. Ideally, what we're looking for purposes of this assignment, though, is something that falls into this category, right? Where rather than having, say, because you could do this with, say, blue squiggles over here, right? And then just a shape with a darker line over here, and then have, you know, your central focal point. This would still balance out. But what we want, I guess I got to redirect the arrow now. We want blue squiggles here, focal point there. So not only same stuff, right, but same visual weight. Not only same visual weight, but same stuff, to accentuate the point. Because what we're trying to do with, when we choose a symmetrical composition, in this, again, in this context, is we're trying to create a certain emotional type of impact. And that impact is, your focal point is a couple of things. First off, important, all caps, kind of screaming at the viewer, so to speak. This is a really easy way of making sure that your audience recognizes that the thing that you're showing them is really important, because your brain is naturally doing this. And so when you show people something like this, it's essentially screaming at them to pay attention to it. So if you've got a really important character, a really important object that's crucial to your story development, and you don't want your audience to miss that, this is the way that you can present it. Now, if you incorporate that with, say, high contrast, right, and you incorporate that with the position of the 1 point vanishing point, right, over top of that, right, so you localize those two things in relationship to each other, all of those things just multiply the exclamation marks, so to speak. Right, so if you really want to make a point, this is a really easy way to do it. Now, a lot of people, predominantly photographers for some reason, fucking hate this type of composition. And there's good reason why. I think the general reason why is because, to use terminology that we use, it feels like this. That's your emotional relationship. it doesn't feel like you've just stumbled into a scene that naturally occurs. Right? It feels like you're watching something or looking at something that has been arranged for you in order to make a point, right? In order to teach you something. It's didactic. So, for instance, like there's a big difference between, say, the way that I'm oriented right now in relationship to the camera, right? This makes me feel a particular way. Now, if I did this, I'm gonna fuck up the recording and everything. All right, let's go. So let's make me symmetrical. Come on. Yeah, oh, pretty close. All right. Now, if I did this, put myself in this dramatic upshot, right? And symmetrified, centrally positioned myself, right? There's a very big difference between the way that I would deliver material in this class if I did it like this all of the time. First off, right, it'd be really fucking weird, right? And, you know, you'd pay attention to it for a little bit, but after a while, it was like, this is just too fucking weird. Why are you talking down to me? Why do you have to, you know, give yourself this German godlike presence, right, in order to convey this information? Right? This, right, is what symmetry does. Right? You combine it with other tools, say like an upshot, right, perfect balance, right, etc. All of that stuff makes it virtually impossible to make that thing feel like it's naturally occurring. You don't have a conversation with a friend like that, for example. Right? You don't post up and start screaming at them face to face, generally speaking, right? Unless you're trying to make an obvious point. Most of the time, you're having a conversation like this. You're just kind of like fucking wandering around looking at shit. Right? You're obliquely oriented to them, right? And you're also asymmetrical. So even if I did this, right? If I just pushed myself off to the side of the frame, right, a little bit, this already feels a little bit more naturalistic. It doesn't feel like I'm trying to make the same dramatic point. This is why I like this class, right, on digital format, right, as opposed to in person, because I can use the frame itself in order to do shit like this. Okay, so this is the emotional consequence that you're going to get if you choose this type of composition, right, in order to make this point. So for, you know, the haters out there, so to speak, yeah, it deserves to be hated because it does this. But if this is what you want to do, then this is a perfect composition, right, in order to make this happen, right? So you guys have you guys, what are they calling your art history class now? Is it art and creativity still?
We've got an art and creativity, and we've got an art and psychology.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Amir is teaching the art and psychology, isn't she?
No, she's art and creativity.
Oh, who's teaching the art and psychology class?
Anna.
Anna.
I've never met Anna. Brad, my friend Brad and I used to teach a combined version of those two classes where that was art history. I would do the art history side of things, and Brad would do a philosophy lecture that was attached to each one of those different art historical periods. Over time, those things have gradually morphed into art and psychology and art and creativity. The point being is that in your art and creativity class, that's kind of like a dehydrated version of the art history class, right? Which was meant to kind of introduce different historical periods. Presumably that is still the case, right? Are you guys now familiar with like a thing called the Renaissance, for example?
We have learned about new classical and romanticism, and a little bit about the Poco period.
Okay, have you referenced the Renaissance at all? Really? Just fucking blew by it, hey? Not even a mention not even a mention for the beginning of modernity. That's where the modern period starts with the Renaissance. Puts a hard stop to the medieval period, so to speak, right? In a textbook type of way. Have you guys heard of Leonardo da Vinci?
Yes.
Okay. Have you heard about one of his most famous paintings, The Last Supper?
Yeah.
Okay. So there are literally thousands of Last Supper paintings. Right? The job of a medieval Renaissance artist, painter, sculptor, whatever, was not to come up with new ideas. Right? Their job was to basically interpret ideas that were handed down through the Bible, right? Present those ideas. And the mark of a really successful, famous artist, especially in the Renaissance, where individual personalities started to become more of a thing, was to interpret those things in really novel ways. So one of the reasons that Leonardo's Last Supper, don't call him Da Vinci, by the way. Da Vinci just means from Vinci, the city of Vinci. Leonardo from Vinci, that's what that that physically means. The reason that Leonardo's is so famous is because of his unique interpretation of this particular picture. Now, what he does with that picture is kind of a poster child for this particular type of composition. You have, as a structure for that picture, this. This is where your central focal area is. This is also where your central vanishing point is. So when you put JC and the boys here, hanging out having dinner, and you put 6 of his buddies over here and 6 of his buddies over here, and Jesus himself directly in the center, conspicuously silhouetted in high contrast, flanked by 2 other windows, isolated from the rest of the crowd, with all lights and lines and perfect balance pointing towards his head directly in the center of the frame, you know absolutely that this picture is about that guy right there. There's no chance for you to think that, well, maybe it's about that person over there. Literally no chance, psychologically, perceptively. And the weird thing about a symmetrical composition is that you can extend this laterally indefinitely, as long as you keep the same characteristics. Perfect balance on either side, centrally isolated or essentially isolated focal point. You could have Jesus and his 12,000 apostles, right, and have this thing be a mile long. It wouldn't matter. Okay. Now, the point of this little parable here is that this, right, is what we might call, right, a perfect combination of medium and message. This is a term that was developed by a guy named Marshall McLuhan in the middle of the 20th century to talk about how different messages were communicated through different forms of advertising, or what we might refer to as social media, right, at this point. More generally speaking, what this means is, like, is the composition that you've chosen, right, the kind of composition that best communicates the message, right, that you want people to interpret. So we've got a really artificial, we could call that staged, otherworldly type of composition. It doesn't feel like when you walk into this room, or if you view this picture, that you just walked into a room and you just see a bunch of people having dinner. Right? It's obviously not that. It's obviously a picture that's designed to teach you something, right? To tell you a particular point. Right? This particular point happens to be a really otherworldly, staged, artificial, supernatural type of act. The transubstantiation of wine and bread into body and blood. So you've got a really unnatural act combined with a really unnatural composition. Because there's no reason that this has to be shown this way. Again, there's thousands of these things. If you fast forward, maybe not thousands, maybe hundreds, exaggerating to make a pedagogical point. If you fast forward just like 50 years to a guy named Tintoretto, all Tintoretto does is this. He pushes the vanishing point up here, plunges the perspective like this, puts poor Judas, historical scapegoat, poor bastard, over here, isolates him on the other side of the table, puts Christ here, puts the rest of his buddies here, right? Puts like a serving person up in front like this, and you get some weird angel floating around up top, and a bunch of smoke and shit, and change the lighting altogether so that it's really dramatic as opposed to really soft, and you get a picture that feels entirely different as a result, right? And it's conflicting at the same time, because we have in this picture have really high contrast here, a vanishing point over here. You get this asymmetrical sense of balance that we're about to go over, right? Point being is that this and this are the same subject matter, but are presented radically differently. And as a result, you get an entirely different message. The message that the Renaissance was trying to communicate was, all right, we live in still a God-filled universe. Right? God is the creator of all things, so to speak, right? And as a result of scientific cultural developments that the Renaissance, right, as a result of being the Renaissance, is now the beginning of modernity with its fascination of what the human intellect and prowess can create, is after reflecting God's perfection through human abilities. perfection of position, balance of composition, right? The universe is an ordered thing and we can understand it. Because of social, political, religious, right, conflicts that occur during that period and extend for the next 150, 200 years, the world starts to fall apart, and so do those belief systems as Europe literally bleeds itself dry for the next 100 years, right? So as a result, faith in that balance, harmony starts to disrupt, right? And you get an entirely different kind of visual picture reflecting that imbalance that's now societal, right? So this is one of the benefits, by the way, of having, right, a smattering of art history, is understanding how the art history reflects what's happening in the world at the time, which, you know, equally helps us understand how the art of our period helps to reflect our time, which basically, if you look closely at the art that's being created right now, all signs indicate that we're insane to pretty much every extent. Okay, so ignore this for right now, right? This is in service of contrast. This is what symmetry is. In your groups this week, one of you is going to have to do a perfectly symmetrical picture, right? But in that perfectly symmetrical picture, I also want you to create high contrast. And I also want you to align that focal point with a 1-point vanishing point. Now, the purpose of doing this, right, is to basically fire on all cylinders in order to create that effect, right? So that when people look at your picture, they know without a doubt what it is they're supposed to be paying attention to. So that guy right there, right? The dramatic upshot of me teaching this class. Any questions as to what symmetry is? Okay, so this is a gloss on what we've already done. The other part, or the other kind of single focal point, is, not surprisingly, asymmetrical, right? We've already done this, right? This is what you did in the assignment after this one in the first term, where you offset the focal point to one side or the other. Now, this is also alternatively known as rule of thirds. Have you guys been exposed to this yet?
Very briefly.
Okay, well, here's a slightly less brief overview of that. Rule of thirds, right, is exactly what it sounds like. It divides the frame up, right, into thirds. Right? And when you guys were doing the assignment in the first term, your job was essentially to put a focal or a breathing or your breathing space or focal area either here or here. Now, rule of thirds is also referred to historically as, it's called a left carré or a right carré. Carré is just a French word for square, right? For those bilinguists amongst us, which I am not one of. So what that refers to, right, is the fact that when you put your focal point or your focal area on this side and your focal area on this side, but then you also combine that with a foreground entrance. So we make all of this stuff here foreground, or all of this stuff here foreground. What that creates is a square left over on one side of the frame or the other. Right? And when we put your focal area in the center of that, what that essentially does for your brain is makes it want to do this. Subdivide that frame in much the same way that it subdivides the frame here. And then as a result, you get that confluence of points towards the center of that square, which creates a natural focal area in the center of that area. Right? So this is when we were introducing the over-the-shoulder shot. Right, last class. This is why this is so useful for that. Because when I put a shoulder here and a head here and put a character there, character A in their service as a foreground entrance basically serves as a frame for your midground focal point. And then your background is literally just that, background, serving as the setting for that particular thing. Right, so as I mentioned last class, is like each one of these areas of the frame are going to have a structural purpose. Your foreground entrance is where your audience physically starts looking at the picture and then serves as a guideline to push you not only to the left, right, but in this instance, also deeper in space towards your focal point. And then generally speaking, what ends up happening in a dialogue scene, and this was the Glengarry Glen Ross thing, is that character A and character B, they just switch sides. Right? So character B now acts as a frame for character A as that foreground entrance, pushing the eye of the viewer over to one side as it's this character's turn to talk. And so these are really useful as a result for conflict scenes or conflict sequences in your story. One character versus another character. One character on one side of the conversation versus another character on one side, the other side of the conversation, literally represented by different sides of the frame. Right, so this is a really convenient way of keeping people kind of engaged with different sides of the story, but also keeping people geographically consistent or geographically oriented in a consistent way with where those different sides of the story are being communicated from. Okay, so those rule of thirds, left carré, right carré, just refers to this, right, in a lateral sense. Rule of thirds is a little bit, it actually refers more to not only doing this, but refers to doing this as well, breaking up the frame in quadrants or sextants, which is very similar to something that we're going to do with multiple focal points and momentarily as well. So there's a crossover between what rule of thirds means in terms of single focal points versus multiple focal points. Now this, right, has consequences as well. This still identifies a single focal point, but now it does so, you can think about it as lowercase. It still identifies a focal point, but now you're not screaming at the viewer, right, in order to do that. And as a result of that, this feels a little bit more natural as well. Okay, so, you know, again, this version of me versus the dramatic upshot German avant-garde, right, symmetrical version, right, of me teaching this class. Okay, so when you want these things, right, this is a really useful structure to choose. Somebody in your group is going to have to do one of each of these. Oh, sorry, two people in your group are going to have to make sure that one of each of these is represented in your story or in this week's assignment. Okay, so it's just a different way of making or of developing a single focal point that softens the visual blow, so to speak. Now, the things that you associate with this in terms of a one-point vanishing point, high contrast, breathing space, isolation, uniqueness, all of those things still apply to accentuating that focal point. Okay, so this isn't to the exclusion of other ways of creating focus. This is an additional commentary on how to create focus. I've literally run out of room on that page. So this is, see if I can actually get this in frame. I can, genius. Okay, that is a nice screen to screenshot. Oh, let's get my fingers out. Nobody wants to see my fingers. Okay, so any questions as to what symmetrical or asymmetrical is? Yet? Okay. So then, multiple focal points. There's two different kinds of this. Neither of which we've done, right, up until this point. One is what we'll refer to as a pyramidal structure. And the other one is an elliptical structure. And both of these, right, create that structure by virtue of what are called visual pathways. Visual pathways are exactly what they sound like. They're pathways for your eyes as opposed to pathways for your feet. Right? So wherever you create these visual pathways, your eye wants to follow them, right, inside of a picture. So a really easy version of a visual pathway is perspective lines. Those visual pathways literally are arrows that point you towards what you're supposed to be looking at. That's my way of combining exclamation marks. Okay, so when you, like, if you go back and look at classical paintings, right? By classical paintings, I basically mean anything from the 15th century on. And you see a stick lying on the ground, right? Pretty common directional device. That stick isn't there just by accident. It's meant to lead you towards a particular point. And now that stick might be leading you towards a point there, right? More commonly, those sticks are kind of like lying on the ground like this, right? To lead you down and then up, right? So that you continue looking at a picture in a particular way. So those sticks, right, are no different than when you see, say, like a standard picture where you've got, you know, a pathway that's leading, right, into, right, you know, a tunnel or a opening in the tree or opening in the tree line. Your eye follows that pathway the same way that the feet of whoever would be walking that pathway is doing. That's just a much more obvious version than this or this. Okay, so that's all that visual pathways are. And those visual pathways can be created by anything. Like this can be a shadow that's being cast by something that's off screen. This can be an object like a stick. This can be a physical person standing here pointing at something, right? That's a really obvious one. It could be a cloud, right, that points down in that direction. All of those things, right, are options, right, for visual pathways. It could be a crack in the wall, a crack in the sidewalk. It doesn't make any difference, right? So any perceptible category is going to create these visual pathways. Now, elliptical pathway looks, you know, something like that. A pyramidal pathway takes on one of two different orientations. You have either a visual pathway that looks something like that, or a visual pathway that looks something like that. In each case, what this does is that this privileges a primary focal point. And that primary focal point is always at the apex of that triangle. But that primary focal point is always supported or accentuated, narratively tied to supporting focal points. The difference between these two structures is basically one of mood. In this one, you get something that elevates the primary focal point, feels like it supports it with a stable base and pushes it up, makes it more important. And it's the structural equivalent of, say, an upshot. This has a compressive feel. Right? Compressive, oppressive, repressive, right? Anything that pushes down on a subject rather than feels like it's lifting it up. So a really obvious example of this one that everybody is probably familiar with, is traditional portraiture. Let's put it in the lateral front. Say a traditional portrait, right, is something like this. This one I think was like something by Titian. Man with a Hat by Symmetrical. That right there, right, creates a primary focal point there, but it creates supporting information by a hand there, elbow there. That whole structure is loosely organized along a triangle that pushes your eye up towards the most important thing in that picture, the face of that person. And as a way of accentuating that narrative, right, the hands that made that person successful, so to speak, right, pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. This is particularly true in portraiture of the 18th century in the Americas, where you have a rising mercantile class that is competing with an old aristocratic class. Say like the portrait of Paul Revere, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with, where you've got Paul Revere's hands as the archetypal self-made person. Paul Revere was a silversmith by trade before he warned the Americans of the British invasion. And as a result of wanting to show off his wealth and status, these things, all of the tools of his trade that are conspicuously laid out on the table in front of him, and the hands that use those tools, accentuate the person. And so basically, it's a nice way of creating a little narrative inside the picture, right, by tying all of these different elements together. Right, so let's say that we did this, you know, in a different kind of narrative. Let's say that we had characters down here. Continue with our biblical theme for the day. There's a nice little pyramidal structure that identifies Sermon on the Mount up there, outcast plebeian followers down here, Roman soldiers in the foreground coming to fuck shit up. Right. All of this stuff gets locked into a pyramidal structure. Now, this, because it's still privileging a primary focal point, if you do this, and I encourage you to do this with your assignment, this would be what I would refer to as a symmetrical structure. Right? Because it's still in the service of identifying that as being the most important thing. It's just complicating it a bit, right, by introducing those things. And same thing if we did some sort of like Kafka-esque judgment scene, right, where you had some unusually situated judge and tribunal set up like this. Whereas like now you have this structure accentuating that there, but now it's pushing down on that character as opposed to elevating that character. Now, in this instance, you know, we can create not only primary focuses, but also a secondary level of importance, because this character is still along that central axis, but they're not at the pinnacle of that pyramid anymore. So as a result, they take on a subordinate level of importance. And then these characters become tertiary in terms of their importance. They basically add to the visual weight that's pushing down on that character. So this and this are both symmetry. You could do the exact same structure asymmetrically. Right, so let's say that we change this a little bit, and now we have all of those characters set up like this. Okay, there's that. And now we really get to show off the Roman soldiers in the foreground with that foreground entrance. Okay, so this is just an asymmetrical application of this, right? And same thing if we did it with this here. Let's say that now I push this off over here. And then maybe in the foreground, I have conspicuously waiting, right? Good old Mr. Guillotine, right? As a way of moving the eye off in this direction, right? So it doesn't matter which structure you choose, asymmetrical or symmetrical, you can apply this pyramidal structure to it. Okay, so I encourage you to try this or incorporate this into your symmetry and asymmetrical structures. The one that's different though is this one, and that's this. And that's literally how I would suggest that you go about doing this. But there's a couple of characteristics to this. The first characteristic is that you have an elliptical visual pathway. Now that visual pathway can create it in a number of different ways, as I've already mentioned. Visual pathways like this, say for instance, here, 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 this is what's called spot jumping. Is that you've located objects that are close enough to each other that your brain naturally connects those things in terms of being a continuous movement. It's like when I was talking about the dot in Pong disappearing and reappearing and being viewed as being the same dot moving along a smooth pathway. It's the exact same thing here. Your brain's connecting those dots. And then same thing here. It's looking for patterns, right? And if it's created, your brain will connect those patterns to each other. Same thing with an ellipse. But the whole point here is to create multiple focal points. Which means this is meant to equivocate. It's meant to make all of those focal points equivalent to each other, not privilege one focal point or another one. So, that being the case, where can you absolutely not put something in the frame?
The center, in the middle of the circle.
Exactly. That's the other characteristic, right? Because as soon as you put something there, that automatically becomes a focal point. Okay, so this has two different characteristics. First off, you have an elliptical visual pathway. Second, nothing in the center, no central object. And that includes along the central axis. Okay, because anything that you put along this axis, anywhere, most conspicuously in the center, is going to start to attract a little bit of attention. Okay, so we want to avoid that altogether. So how does this work then? Your job is to literally do this. This is the easy way of doing this. I'm going to show you the complicated way of doing this afterwards because I think it's important to know so that when you come across it inevitably in your aesthetic pursuits in the future, you can say, it's like, hey, I know an easy way to do that, as opposed to this shitstorm of complexity that you're introducing me to. Easy way of doing this is just populate this light pathway that you're putting into your frame. Sometimes these are referred to as rectangular visual pathways as well. So you could think about doing this, mimicking the rectangle of your frame with a smaller rectangle inside that frame, and then drawing an ellipse around that particular thing. They have a close relationship, as you'll see in a second. So when you put those light indications in, your job is to now populate that pathway and keep shit out of the center. So how do you populate that? There's a foreground chunk of space there. That takes care of that part of the frame. There's a midground chunk of space there that takes care of that part of the frame. I know I need to populate this area, so I'm going to put a foreground tree here, and I'm going to populate this area of the frame with the canopy of that tree. That takes care of that section of the ellipse. I'm going to put a little house on the hillside as opposed to the prairie over here. Isn't that quaint? That takes care of that part. I'm going to put a chimney here. That takes care of that part. Now your job is to close this circle so that when your audience looks at this, there's no escape from this pattern. There's no good evidence to suggest outside of foreground information that people start looking at this picture in any particular place other than what I've already mentioned in terms of privileging left to right. But once your audience recognizes that pattern, they're trapped inside that pattern. Right? And they leave when they're ready to leave, as opposed to leaving because the picture forces them to leave in a particular way. So if you wanted to close this pattern, what area do you need to fill?
The top right.
Top right, that's it. All right, so what do we put here?
An airplane.
Sure, it could be just that, right? There's an airplane. Great. Crashing into something that's off frame. So now you spot jump from there to there. You could also put a cloud here, right? And behind that to make it more obvious. You could put smoke from a chimney, right? That happens to be blowing in that direction. You could put a flock of birds here about to fly into the engine of said plane that is going to crash into, all right, village off screen. Right? And once you recognize this, it becomes painfully obvious when people do this compositionally. So for instance, like one of my favorite painters, Norwegian painter, I was studying with him years ago. He's got a painting that looks like this, essentially. You've got a line of hills off in the background. You've got a shoreline, a beach line that's set up like this. You've got a bunch of people that are sitting on the beach in really creepy, weird positions, all like this. You've got a lone figure standing in the water over here with a shadow that's cast like that. And to fill this gap in, I shit you not, literally put in, right, the jet stream trailer from a plane up here. And that's it. That's that pattern. No central focal point. Nothing along that central axis that's going to draw conspicuous attention. Right? And then all of these things are locked into a narrative. So if I want to create a little narrative here, you know, I can put a person sitting underneath that tree, Isaac Newton, waiting for the apple to fall on his head, right, so that he can discover gravity, right, go home to Mrs. Newton, keeping the home fires burning, right, as they gradually wait for air travel to be invented. That never happened. The apple falling on Newton's head never happened. He did discover calculus and gravity, right, while he was spending time avoiding the plague in the English countryside, right? But he also never had a Mrs. Newton either. Never had sex, Isaac Newton. Lifetime celibacy. Considered it his greatest achievement. Gravity and calculus apparently took second and third place to lifetime celibacy, which, you know, fair enough, right? Okay, so that's the easy way of doing this. This also is closely related to your rule of thirds by now populating the frame in a not dissimilar way. However, more specifically, you will come across this referred to as your golden section. If you know anything about composition, this is probably what you know about it, right? Because the Greeks discovered it, the Romans stole it, and it was lost for a while, and then the Renaissance rediscovered it, and right, we've been plagued with its complexity ever since. And because of this thing being based on the Fibonacci sequence, which you can break down, which is a mathematical sequence, which you can break down into geometric formula, which you can apply to a frame, which creates patterns that people have been finding embedded in shit in the universe for the last 2,500 years. Okay. What that thing whether or not you call it as the golden mean, right? The golden rule, the divine section, mean, rule, whatever, they all mean the same thing, right? And what they refer to is breaking up the frame in a very particular way. Fibonacci sequence is this. Start with 0, go to 1. Add the next two numbers together, you get 1. Add the previous two numbers together, you get 2. Add the previous two numbers together, you get 3. Add the previous two numbers together, 5. Add the previous two numbers together, you get 8, etc., etc., etc. And what that does is that when you break that up, so the theory goes, right, is that you get this type of spiraling effect, right? As that frame breaks up into smaller and smaller quadrants, as you get further and further and further and further back towards the origin point. I don't know exactly how that breaks up, but there is an example of it in your handout. Now, the reason that this is important, right, is because of how you break the frame up for a golden section, right, and why this works, or rather why this works. How you would do this, you don't need to know this. This is just for shits and giggles and interest value. There's also a breakdown of this in your handout, is that you take any corner and diagonally connect it to the other corner. And then off a 90-degree line, connect the other corner, right, to that point. That creates a bisecting point that you then put a horizontal and vertical line through. That creates a confluence of points there. That creates a focal point. You do the exact same thing in the other direction. And then you do the exact same thing in the other direction. And to your great surprise and horror, what you get is 4 focal points that look like this, that when you connect them, an ellipse, create this. And then you're keeping shit out of there. So there's lots of information about this, and people get all shit and giggly about this, right? Because you can subdivide each individual frame now ad infinitum, right? On and on and on and on and on. Right, so this is a useful thing to know. However, outside of one really strange instance, I don't know anybody who composes like this. Right? I know lots of people who compose like this, right? Where you basically just keep pushing shit around until it looks okay along that elliptical path, and you don't put shit here if you don't want people to pay attention to something in particular. Now, what you will see is that this is generally combined with something that kind of closely resembles a symmetrical composition a lot. Because as soon as I put in the dragon that ultimately killed Sir Isaac Newton and his wife, most people don't know about that in the historical archives, right? But it did happen, right? And when that dragon flies over top of the hillside, we know what's going to happen, right? And Newton's going to have to scramble to figure out calculus and gravity before he meets his fiery end. Imagine if this was the only archive, the only historical archive that was left after the apocalypse. There'd be so many questions. Sorry, what are dragons? Sorry, who's Isaac Newton? Gravity. How did they relate to each other? Oh, the mystery that I've just unfolded across upon future generations. These are times where I really like my job, where this ridiculous shit comes out of my face. Not that I don't really like my job at other times. These are just particularly enjoyable moments for me. Well, hold on, tripod's making me more German. By more German, I mean more avant-garde. What?
No, I just said RJ.
Oh no, you can't do that, dude. That's not something that can just fly in polite society anymore. Right? Maybe if you just like reround history, say 75 years in a very particular area, right? Yeah, that might fly. But
Yeah.
my framer, as an aside note, Hunter, right? A little bit rednecky, nice guy, right? Not a mean bone in his body. Texts me, maybe a couple of months ago, and says, "Hey, I got some shit to show you from that I just inherited from my uncle, who was in a Saskatchewan regiment fighting the Nazis in World War II. You guys are interested in historical shit, right? I was like, yeah, absolutely. Sends me pictures of a Nazi flag, swastika, Luftwaffe, the whole thing. It's got two of them, one screen printed, right, one hand stitched. I'm like, holy shit, dude, what the fuck is that?
Whoa.
Yeah, his uncle was stationed in Leipzig and took this stuff back stateside, and they've been sitting in the closet for the last 70 years. And he just passed, and my buddy inherited this shit. When I went over and saw it, it's like he unfolded these things, like there's literally blood, oil, mud stains on them still. And I'm like, dude, these are fucking intense. What the fuck are you gonna do with these things? And then he shows me a picture of him and his uncle in the Okanagan holding one of these Nazi flags in the middle of the countryside. And I'm like, dude, burn that fucking photo immediately. Right? It's like, I know that this has like sentimental value for you, but I mean, this is some heavy shit here, dude.
Yeah.
He's like, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with them. I think I'm just going to kind of live with them for a bit, and then I'm going to donate them to a museum, like a Holocaust museum or Humanity Museum, right? Whatever that thing is in Manitoba. But I mean, historical archives, right, have some heaviness to them in general, but that shit was beyond the pale. Gives you chills just thinking about it. Anyway, so this is the hard way of doing golden section. I would recommend doing this. One of you is going to have to do this in your assignment. Screenshot this page. Do you guys have any questions about what pyramidal or elliptical visual pathways are? Okay, your assignment then. You are not surprisingly now working in groups of 4 as a minimum. For a minimum, if the numbers don't work out, 7 maximum. Right? Again, no, you can't do it by yourself. No, you cannot do it in any groups that aren't in between these 2 digits.
We are in 2 groups of 5, so it works now.
Perfect. Amazing. That's great. So we remember our narrative arc, right, from last class. You now have a setup section, or you still have a setup, a conflict section. You still have a resolution section. For your conflict section, impress me with your short-term memory. What structures are going to go with the conflict section?
Narrative.
Yes, for foreground. So you have to use foreground, right, in narrative. But what 2 structures did we just use that accentuate conflict? Look back at your screenshots. I specifically wrote it down.
Pyramid.
Pyramidal.
Sort of, depending on if you combine it with what?
The asymmetrical rule of thirds thing.
The asymmetrical rule of thirds stuff. Okay, so in your handout, I forgot to mention this. These are going to be referred to as focus forced right or focus forced left. Focused forced right just means that you have your focal point on the right-hand side and your foreground on the left-hand side. Focused forced left just means that your focal point is on the left-hand side, your foreground entrance is on the right-hand side. Okay, so those are your 2 asymmetrical structures. So for those of you who are doing this, you have to label your narrative use of foreground, and you have to label whether or not you're doing this or this. Whether or not you label it FFR, FFL, asymmetrical right, asymmetrical left, left carré, right carré, I don't care what you label it, as long as you know what it is that you're doing and you label it, right, accordingly. Okay, so again, labeling, cannot stress it enough. Please label the things that I'm asking you to label. If you're doing a setup, you want to establish a bunch of information. What structure is going to work really well for that?
The circular one? Oh, sorry, elliptical.
Great. So this is your golden section, elliptical, right? Whatever it is you want to label. Right? Whoever's doing that has to do this. You can use foreground here if you want. If you use foreground, you have to label it narrative or descriptive. Right? So foreground here is optional. Which means that whoever's doing the resolution scenes is doing a symmetrical scene, right? You're putting an exclamation point to the end of your story, right? Letting people know when to clap, so to speak, right? Again, foreground here is optional. If you use it though, label it narrative or descriptive. Again, we're thinking about we're using still value is attached to all of your drawings now, right? At that 5 value, right, representation of depth. And here we're moving from a low contrast situation to a high contrast situation, right? And gradually increasing that contrast as we move along. Also, what did we do? We did light to dark last time. Let's do it the other direction now. Let's go dark to light. Right, so we get that reversal of fortune as well, but now we're dealing with the comedy, right, rather than the tragedy. Okay, so again, because you're working in groups of 5, I guess, you could have one of these, you have to have 2 of these, you have to have one of those, you could have an extra one of any one of these in order to extend the conflict, extend the setup, extend the resolution. Right? Totally up to you in your groups. Okay. Again, give these to one person in order to upload. Okay. Again, name number 1, name number 2, etc. .pdf under 10 meg. Right, again in order, right, and then again due before next Friday morning. Okay, so no differences there. Okay, any questions as to your assignment? Did you guys have problems with anybody like contributing to your individual groups, like actual drawings, or is that a problem that we have to face for this particular group of people? Because generally it is, right? But maybe you guys are the rare bunch that isn't.
We had a little bit difficulty with the timing of the project.
Okay, but timing's one thing, but you got everything that you needed to get it in on time.
Yeah.
Okay, if you come across the instance where you don't have everything that you need to get it in on time, insert a blank piece of paper, right, for that particular frame, right, and then just associate the name that goes along with that, so that I can make sense of the story, right, and see where the gap is, right, as a result. What you can also do, right, is just write down brief description of the subject, right, inside the frame. Right, so don't stress out about this. Again, you're not being marked as a group. You're being marked individually, right, for these initial subjects or these initial topics. There will be, your last assignment will be marked, as there will be a group mark to it, but that'll make more sense, right, as we get closer to it. And this will be the way that we get across, you know, this particular problem as well at that point. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of events. Okay, before we look at the examples that I wanted you to look at, any questions? Did all the links that I sent you guys work?
Yeah.
Nice. That makes me happy. All right, the Road to Perdition example that I wanted you guys to watch is particularly good. Oh my God, Dune is coming out. I'm so excited about that movie. I haven't been this excited about a movie in God knows how long. I think the last time I was this excited about a movie was when Lord of the Rings came out. Where I was literally jumping up and down and clapping when it first started. So happy.
I'm looking forward to the Lord of the Rings series Amazon's making.
Yeah,
I know someone that's in it.
Oh, nice.
Back.
Ooh.
Dylan Smith.
I am very excited to see what they do with that, because I mean they've got pretty big boots to fill.
It's a prologue, right?
Oh, is it? It's the
Isn't
Silmarillion?
it? I think so. I think it's like not in the storyline. It's something else. Like
That's
they're not
interesting.
redoing it or anything.
I think it's before everything happened.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it would be the Silmarillion then. That'll be interesting because the Silmarillion is not an easy read for those of you guys who have tried to read it. It is pretty arcane and essentially like reading like Greek mythology, if anybody's ever tried to do that. But I mean, if you were to Hollywoodize that, right, and make it a little bit more user friendly, the imagery in it, oh my God, it could be spectacular. Anyway, I'm very curious. Let's this movie, by the way, if you guys are interested in cinematography, this is done by Sam Mendes, I think in 2000, 2002. Oh, look at that, 2002. Yeah. Is a perfect movie in terms of like developing character and narrative relationships through the use of cinematography. It's exceptionally well done. I wanted to save this. Sorry?
Oh, I was just gonna say we watched this in my English class last year.
Oh, nice. Good for your English teacher. This is an excellent example in a number of different ways. First off, okay, so because you guys have watched this already, we can, kind of fast forward through a lot of this. What POV are you in here? First person or third person?
Third person.
Third person. You're third person, but you're really close to that kid. Hold on a sec. Cops are coming to get me again. It's funny, my studio mate is actually a detective with the VPD. I get all manners of horror stories from him on a regular basis. He used to work in homicide in the forensics unit, and now he works in sex crimes as a detective. The shit that we never hear about in this city is fucking horrifying. Anyway, so we're third person, really close proximity to this kid. This is important, right? Because this scene is trying to deliver two distinctly important messages, right? That are interrelated with each other. So when we're watching this kid, we get to see this kid's reaction to what it is that he's seeing, right? And then when we're in third person here, we see him looking at something, and then we cut to now what? First person or third
First person.
First person. So now you physically are that kid, which is a very effective way of now getting you to experience what that kid is experiencing. So you guys have seen this clip. What is this kid experiencing?
Like
What does this kid see?
A murder.
A murder, right? A bunch of murders, right? And who is the person, right, that is doing some of the murdering?
His dad.
His dad. So this is this kid's rough introduction to his dad's world. So what's important about this clip is two things: that this kid witnesses a murder, right? And this kid, right, witnesses that murder, right? And his reaction to that. So the way that this scene is set up is incredibly successful for doing this. So here you have this in first person, and look what the foreground entrance is. The foreground entrance, what are these things here?
Someone's foot.
Someone's foot. Whose foot? Whose feet?
His dad.
His dad's. All right. And look at the way that that's structured. You guys can see my drawing pad, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
This is the way that this structure is set up. Right. So you have feet here, legs there. Look at the structure that that creates there. And then inside there, you get this as a structure with those two characters' heads at the pinnacle point of that. So you get essentially a symmetrical composition with a pyramidal structure attached to it that elevates and accentuates that point right there. Now, what this also does is it opens up this space and this space here, right? Because when Daniel Craig, before he was James Bond, right, decides to step off over here, look at how the structure changes, because the camera now shifts slightly to the right. And now you've got this pyramidal structure over here, but you also have all of this space over here. So now you've got an asymmetrical sense of focus over there. You don't have a foreground entrance, right? This is something that I haven't gone over, right? But we can save for a later time. It doesn't have to be foreground that fills this space. It just has to be space that fills that space, right? In this case, it's darkness pushing the eye over towards lightness over here. And this character is still set up as your focal point. This is important, right? Because now when the camera swings in the other direction, cutting on action, wham. Now we've got, oops. Now you've got a scene that does this. Pant leg here, and now you get the two goons coming in over there. Right, so here we get focus directed in the same direction. But notice if you think about it this way, all of this stuff is happening here. All of this stuff is happening here. And if you looked at this picture from a bird's eye view, this is what you would see. You have the wall here, you have the kid here, you have Tom Hanks here, you have these two characters here, providing a space over here and a space over there. What you have is Tom Hanks as a central connector to all of those different aspects of the story, literally acting as a wall in between his son and this world, but also acting as an entrance, right, to the realities of that world. So this is what I mean by this movie is exceptionally well done in terms of like staging events, cinematography wise, cinematically, as a way of communicating narrative points, character relationships like this. What it's also very good at doing is this. And this is why it's important that we shift between first person and third person. Because what are you in here? First person or third person?
First person.
First person.
First person. All right. And now, what are you in?
Third person.
You're still in first person because you're still the kid. But what's happened? What's the difference?
It's like zoomed in. You're closer.
You zoomed in. You've gotten closer, which means that this has become more or less important to the kid.
More important.
More important. Now look at where this guy's head is. Okay, and look at the third of the frame that it's in. Look at where all of this stuff was happening, right, in those previous sequences. You've constantly been directed towards that area of the frame, right? And then when it cuts back to third person, look at where your eye is, right? And as it cuts back and forth between first person and third person, what the kid's seeing and what that kid is reacting like, look at where both of those things maintain their position. So what you get is this constant reinforcement of first person, third person, what the kid saw, how it's affecting him, what the kid saw, how it's affecting him, as it's reflected by continually being glued to the same area of the frame the entire time. It's a very effective way of compounding and accentuating that point. Okay, so what other examples did I ask you to watch in this sequence?
There was the one where they're like under the church, and he said only two of us, or only one of us can see heaven. And then there was the Lego ones.
Right. And that sequence with them underneath the church ended with Tom Hanks gunning down Paul Newman in the alley.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good example, right, of, I think that's an easy clip to find. Yeah. I fucking hate ads. This is a really good example of your over the shoulder shot. Right, so here's your focus force left, right, with your focal point off in the background over here. And this is an important distinction between structural focus here and then focus, depth of field focus. As I've mentioned a number of times, there's lots of different ways of creating focus, creating importance in a picture. And some are more effective than others. So high contrast being the most effective for our purposes. Detail is another one, right? Because when we bring something into focus, we can see all that detail. So when you physically bring something into focus in terms of depth of field, we pay more attention to this than we pay to structural focus, right? So this picture is basically telling you two different things at the same time. Pay attention to this, but also pay attention to this and that narrative relationship. Now, when Paul Newman turns, this is called rack focus. Essentially what happens is that as Paul Newman turns, the camera operator pushes a button on the camera that readjusts its focal length so that it now coincides with the mark that Tom Hanks has now stepped to. And now you have structural focus and focus, depth of field focus aligning. Now you pay no attention to this character, all of your attention to this character. Right now, this relationship just continues. Here you get your focus force left, there you get your focused force right. Right? There's your focal point, there's your foreground entrance. These two characters maintain their positions in the frame. And all that happens as this scene gets more intimate is that you zoom in on those characters. You get closer and closer to those characters. And now here's your rule of thirds. Right? There's no foreground entrance anymore, but this character is still on the right. And there's no foreground entrance here. This character is still on the left. And this is the whole point of, as I mentioned last time, a close-up. You get to see all of the facial nuances as this character, right, engages in essentially killing his dad. Right? A really, right, one would assume emotional and intensely emotional event for this character. Okay, so this is a really good example of that. As I mentioned last day, I just want to bring up the Glengarry Glen Ross sequence again because it's a really good example of golden sections. This should make even more impact now in terms of like that focused force left and this relationship that's being set up between multiple focal points in different ways now between these two characters and their relationship to the other characters in that office. Here's a good example of a golden section, right? Spot jumping from character to character to character to character, right? And the board and all of the objects around a rough circular orientation. No character is really more important than the other in this particular instance. They're all connected along a sequence. Now, when this character, the Alec Baldwin character, moves into a more prominent position, you can see that this character is now the head of a rough triangle as well, right? So they're mixing and matching these particular things. Fuck you, that's my name. And now we're into some sort of like golden section type of thing. Spot jumping from here to this contrast, the coffee machine, here to here, the diagonal of the chair, the diagonal of the boxes, and then the thing just continues. There's a good example of a symmetrical scene in here as well, I think. There. Yeah, decent. Right? There's a little bit offset. You push this character. I think it's maybe. That's about as close to a symmetrical scene as you get, right, in this sequence. When this character initially asserts their authority in this sequence, and also they do this really cleverly as well, sets up the antagonism between that character and this character. Notice how they're on the same side of the frame, right, where they're basically locked, right, into some sort of confrontation, right, with each other. Okay, so that's a really good example, right, of golden section, not so much of symmetry. Easy versions of symmetry to follow in this one. The reason that I wanted you to look at the Lego stuff, right, is because these things are done. It's useful to look at amateur film to basically look at what's trying to be done, both communicated as well as presented, but how you could fix it up a little bit. Right, in addition to just being funny. Okay, so here. The whole idea behind this is, how could you take this scene and just make it a little bit better? Right, good way of thinking about this is like, what do you want to communicate in this scene? Right, so what's important to this story? What are the elements that are important to this story? The physical objects.
The
Who and what?
trays.
The trays and who is important?
Darth Vader and the server.
Perfect. All right. So what is this thing over here?
A cauldron of some sort?
Okay. Do you have any idea what it is? Absolutely.
No.
Do you need to know what this thing is?
No.
Do you need to see this thing as a result?
No.
No. So what would be a better way of showing this? What's the easiest way of making this just a little bit better, right? And also getting rid of this at the same time.
Zooming in a little bit and cropping like half of Darth Vader and like
Yeah.
the rest.
Perfect. So zoom in so your crop is like this. And then you got a nice little focus force left. Trays are off to the outside. This character is your focal point. Of all the information that you need is now there. If you do that, what you've also done here is associated Darth Vader with the right-hand side of the frame, this character with the left-hand side of the frame. So now we want to try to maintain that relationship. So when we go here, what's the problem with this?
It's puts them around.
It's flipped them around, right? So we want this character over here, this character on the other side of the frame. What could you do to increase the importance of Darth Vader? What could you change?
Move the cups out of his.
Move the cups, get rid of this shit right here. You can still have the cups out over here. You don't need to have them there, right? So this happens a lot during this sequence, right? But these are really easy changes that you can make in order to make this just a little bit better. Right? The other one's even better for this. What structure is this? Symmetrical, asymmetrical, golden section, what?
Symmetrical.
Symmetrical.
Kinda symmetrical.
Symmetrical, kind of symmetrical. What's your focal point?
The window.
No.
The window. Why is that a problem?
Because it's irrelevant to the story.
It's irrelevant to the story. This is a great example of what I was talking about, raising expectation in your viewer. Your viewer now expects something to happen here. And if nothing happens here, your viewer is left wondering, why did you make me pay attention to that shit? It's distracting to the story. They do the same thing later on, asymmetrically, which is equally irritating. Here, again, you're expecting like a character to pop through the window, right? Or to pop their head up in the window. And that's especially irritating because they did it more effectively here. Right? Yes, walls have windows. This is a more effective way of showing that that wall has a window and decreasing its importance to the story. It also nicely allows you to nicely frame these characters with the surrounding wall. Right? Likewise, earlier on, right, in this sequence. Where would you expect a focal point to be inserted into this frame? Where's the conspicuously empty space?
Right.
The right side.
On the right-hand side of the frame. So if you were to redesign this, where would you put this door?
The right-hand side.
On the right-hand side, right? Because you could still change the angle of orientation and still create this nice little pyramidal structure here once you zoom in. But even here, what can you do to this area as a way of making it a little bit better?
Move it over so the table's not in its like.
You could keep the table in it, right? Because that creates a nice firm platform to that basis of the triangle.
Move the cup a little bit so it doesn't get over the person.
Yep. Even easier, rotate the cup, right? So that the handle's on the other side. What about this space in behind this character? What could you do? What could you do to make that character's silhouette just a little bit clearer, unobstructed?
Open the door fully.
Open the door altogether, right? So, I mean, those are little decisions, right? Just little tweaks that you might make, right? When you do your initial thumbnail or your initial drawing of a scene, it's like, oh, I didn't catch this to begin with. I can just tweak that as a detail stage, right? So that's a little thing. The structure of this is fine. This is a structural problem, right? Where you've got everything kind of clustered over here in all this dead space where you're expecting things to happen and then nothing happens, right? So two different kinds of problems. One's much easier to solve than the other one. This, if you're far enough down the track, is really difficult to change. This is really easy to change because it's just a matter of pushing shit, right? As opposed to changing everything. Okay, so those are fun exercises that he's got a whole series of these things as well. They're not only, fun, but they're informative if you try to like go through them and just basically catch the shit that's wrong with them and how you could, change that as an intellectual exercise for yourself if you're interested in such things as they might contribute to your understanding of this class and other things. That is it. Those are all the words that have to come out of my face for today. Do you have any questions about your assignment or the material that we covered today before I indulge individual questions about your individual assignments? All right.